What's up, book lovers? Here we are once again, Marisa Serafini and Phil Svitek. This month, we're talking about Alex Garland's The Beach. This is our July pick, my choice. I wanted to pick this one because first, I've heard about the movie. I've seen it a couple times. You and I are very well aware of Alex Garland. Hopefully, like the whole world knows about his, or has heard of his name, has seen his books, or like seen his movies, read his books. I feel like he's in the zeitgeist of the last 20 years. It's like you've seen or heard something of his. And I wanted to cover it because I just came back from a tropical island beach like vacation. So it was kind of like fresh on my mind, like, oh, let's read about a book and a group of people and their experience on a beach. And fortunately, my experience wasn't as daunting as this one. So, yeah, Phil, let's what were your quick thoughts about this book?
Uh, In a way, it's kind of like Lord of the Flies, but with adults, you
A
know,
bit, yeah.
and sort of slightly more mature themes, if you will. Not like it's group. I mean, there's some grotesque stuff in there and here and there, but yeah, I think where Lord of the Flies kind of explores, how people behave and create society. This has elements of that, but it's also more about the protection of this faraway paradise. Call it Eden,
Right.
call it heaven on earth, whatever you want. But there it is. And I think that to me is the most interesting aspect of it. It is very much different than the movie. The movie is much more like a romance drama. This one
Mm-hmm.
is much more headier and not quite what I was expecting. I thought, there would be some more. I thought for some reason there would be like supernatural elements because that tends to be Alex Garland's certainly
Right.
kind of, film wise, more of his MO. But um, yeah, I didn't find it bad, but I didn't find it like great either, unfortunately.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. As I was reading, quite honestly, I got like really bored around page 200. In this book, it's like it's a pretty dense book. On my certain copy printed version, there's 430 something pages. I was like, oh my God, are we getting somewhere? Because I didn't realize how day to day it was going to be following these people's lives. Mostly Richard, our main protagonist, is just like literally every day we're just following him and seeing what he's doing and who he's talking with and him like going fishing or him doing this or there's a whole page of him going to the fucking bathroom. It's like literally every detail and just following him, and I didn't realize the book was going to just be that. It kind of reminded me of another book that we read, Cold Mountain. If you read that, that's like just like a daily recount of following just someone waiting for something to happen. um
But something more
and
happens in that book versus here. Like here, it's just kind
right.
of I mean, there's a lot of setup in the beginning with like the cops and like the whole point of Duffy, I don't know, it never fully comes back in a more significant way. I mean, it does and it doesn't, but we'll talk about that.
Right, absolutely. And it's like it had a solid start. Like you said, Daffy, who's just recurring character who's constantly like taunting Richard throughout this book. Hopefully it like gets him somewhere, but it really doesn't, like you said, come much comes out of that. There's like allusions to sharks, and like there's always the this like lingering suspense that something's gonna happen. But when we're watching these people just live their life day after day, you're like, what the fuck is gonna happen? Like, let's get to it. And I feel like in this book, not to like jump too ahead, but like we finally get a chain of events that starts derailing everybody. And then that's when it finally happens. But it happens so late in the book, and you're like, oh, things are getting interesting. But shit, it's like the last 100 pages. Um,
They really
so
layered in,
yeah.
we had to the payoffs, yeah, it's a slow burn. You have to
Very,
really
very
wait.
slow burn. It's
But
a very, very slow burn. Yeah, so basically like it's a very simple plot too, if you think about it. You have Richard, our main protagonist. He's just an American who's traveling by himself. over in Bangkok, Thailand, and he hears about this mysterious island paradise from this crazy, quote unquote, old man, crazy man named Daffy, Mr. Daffy. Um, like basically he starts this whole idea like, hey, there's this beach, let's go. I'm not doing anything. He tags along with two French people and they make friends and they set off to this paradise of a beach. And even like the moment they get there, it's not perfect. And like it's just obstacle after obstacle. And you're like, oh, if this is how we start, it's such a task to get to said island. You know it's just gonna get worse from there.
Yeah.
So well, what were your thoughts of like these three, Etienne, Francois, Francois? I don't know. I don't speak French. You got the French couple and Richard going to an island, and things just kind of start from there.
Yeah, I mean, overall, with my knowledge of the movie, that's where it led me kind of astray because in the movie it becomes a love triangle. Here, they are just a triangle.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, like to get to the island in and of itself is a whole journey because Daffy ultimately dies, but it's a suicide death. And so, Richard ends up lying to the police and things like that. And so, like, there's all these elements. They're not really supposed to leave, but they choose to leave because why not? And so it's like this kind of big setup of like, okay, you're essentially a fugitive, but oh, that doesn't ultimately really matter. Um, and like how they get there again, like really the only major significant point is that okay, uh, Richard told about the place and gave the map to two Americans. Uh, and then for them getting there, like it was a whole dossier of how we were gonna like do this. And it's like ultimately
Mhm.
like, okay, cool. I just need to know you got there.
Right.
You had a plan, you got there, cool, got it. Moving.
Yeah. And then they finally get to said beach, um, after having gone through the cannabis field, the lagoon, and like the major swim that they had to do. There were just like so many steps just to get there. And then they find this, community that's already there, and they assimilate their lives with these people. But I something that I feel like, and we'll definitely talk about like the differences of the movies and the book. But something I think the movie hits on better is the specialness of the community and keeping it a secret. How protected they get of no one can know where this beach is, no one can know we're here. Like literally defend this place for your life. And it was like something that's touched upon in the book. Like, yeah, all right, people come in here and there, and like obviously we have like 30 plus people, so people do know about this, but it was like way more protective in the movie. And like that idea of just like it's this the fragility and the specialness of the place made it like there was a bigger jeopardy, something bigger to lose at the end.
Yeah, and that to me ultimately was sort of the intriguing part of all of it, right? I mean, it is that weird dichotomy, we all want to see places untouched, but as soon as people know about it, it gets touched,
Right.
like everyone always wants to go to the Greek islands. Fine, they're beautiful, but they are it becomes such a tourist trap that everything gets catered around tourists. I mean, even just look at Hawaii, right? I mean, there's the whole thing of like, please don't come here for tourism, because so
Right.
many hotels and even Airbnbs have essentially been erected for the purposes of tourists versus, there's no place to, in theoretic, there's less places to live for the actual natives and stuff like that, right? So,
Right.
you're essentially stripping the actual place of its own thing. So, that theme was very evident for sure.
Yeah, it's like the whole idea of it's only special when it's more exclusive. And if you allow this openly to other people, people are just gonna ruin the the specialness of what they have. So um I definitely understood that. What were your thoughts of once we get to the community and we're like getting introduced to all these different types of people? I mean, we meet people here and there, and like a lot of names do get thrown around. But like we have our like main groups of people that have their special position job details on the island. Like one's dedicated to farming and gardening, one's dedicated to cooking and fishing. So like everyone has their role on the island to keep that community going. So what were your thoughts of the characters that we meet and how they played into the story?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think Garland in general is very concerned with the mechanics of all of this, right? And so I think we spend so much time in general just viewing of, okay, well, how does this society function if it were a true society? It's like, I know you know that as a writer, right?
Hmm.
You don't need to like literally give me a manual of it. So I think ultimately once you kind of you start to see the patterns, right? So Sal is by default
The
the
leader.
leader of the whole thing. And so it's like, okay, cool, got that. And you start to see who's in relation to that, and you start focusing on those people versus, so you kind of almost have to do your own mental gymnastics of who's important and who's not, you
Hmm.
know? And at some point, certain people that you didn't expect to be important do end up being important, but it's okay because you just really need to track the act of it versus knowing that, all that.
Right. Who's expendable and who's not. It's like Sal has, because she is in a position of authority there, like just making sure everyone's getting things done. But also, you see, she also plays like internal politics. She has to be kind of unbiased towards everybody. And like they constantly said the lines like, she doesn't give into favoritism either. It's like, yeah, she's dating Bugs, the guy Bugs, who's like the local carpenter, but she still like lets other people do certain roles if she feels like they're better equipped for it. So, so it's like it's good to have like a fairly level-headed person in charge of all that, and then you get the different eccentric, types of people that we meet, and we get the Swedes, the three guys. We get Jed and Keaty. Keaty played a bigger role, I feel, than I was expecting, especially rewatching the movie and then like reading his importance of the book. He's like that one good true friend that's kind of consistent throughout. He's like, okay, we need at least one sane person here. And it felt like Kitty was like the solid, consistent person for us to like us as readers to just lean on, like, okay, shit's going down, but we can rely on Kitty for something. Um, what were your thoughts of like, well, once we finally get through like the day-to-day life and stuff, something does happen, uh, and just kind of like snowball effect. You know how like bad things come in threes. It's like always that kind of thing that gets the ball rolling. There is a day of the shark attack, and that attacks the Swedes, uh, and that kind of really just starts the the terrible, the terrible things that just keep happening day to day, and also the food poisoning. They all like happen within 24 hours, which really like affects people mentally and emotionally, and affects the community, and that's where things start to derail. So, what were your thoughts of the turning point climax, I guess, of the story?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because in some sense they're isolated events. Whereas again, if I'm looking at it from a story perspective, we got that whole beginning with Duffy, and then we got the two Americans, and then with Jed, he goes back into essentially town. So they're not cut off from the rest of the world. Like when they need supplies, they're gonna get the supplies.
Yeah, they can go
Um,
back out.
yeah, so it seemed like the idea was that the world was closing in on them. Um, whereas, the food poisoning and the shark, that's just kind of like an everyday danger type of thing that didn't feel like, oh, it's a narrative push forward of this greater thing. You get what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Like it's just because it's like those things happen, but it's not like all of it, but we've already spent so much time there. And by the time Richard and the two others get there, this community's been thriving for whatever, 6+ years. So it's not like a survivalist type of thing where we're with them like day one, day two, and surviving in and of itself is an arduous journey. You know what I'm saying?
Right. And it's also like the things that kind of happen, for the most part, were preventable. Like killing a squid and feeding it to everybody. Admittedly, it was an accident, but something that could have been prevented. It's like when you do something over and over again for so long, and they're all like very, very comfortable in that community. They get to the point where they get too autopilot and they're not thinking anymore, and then they become their own worst enemies. And I felt like that's kind of what happened. Like they just got so caught up in their everyday, regular, motions that like, oh yeah, I was fishing, but I didn't think much of it, that this could have killed half the camp. So that caused a lot of internal problems. Like, you got me sick. I feel like shit. I'm shitting myself, like Bugs got even mad at Richard. And now people are, it's like also misplaced anger and pride. People are like blaming Richard for not being there and helping, and just like people are frustrated with themselves. Very preventable things. Shark, yeah, I mean, I guess you could have prevented it had you not swam in the river, in the water there, but it's like, so it's the external things also on the island that are like slowly, literally killing them. Um, and that's where I feel like everything started to snowball
Well, did you
there.
think, in some ways, the sort of, I guess, angle to look at it is that they've glamorized this whole island, and yes, while they've managed to survive, there's almost like, whether spoken or unspoken, this element of like, hey, society was kind of nice, you
Mm,
know? Whereas here, it's like, okay, as you said, like there's the monotony of the day to day, the this and that. And unfortunately, yeah, if you allow yourself to slip for even a moment, it has major repercussions. And so that, if anything, was kind of what I took away from those instances of that. In an odd way, there was this longing for just society in general, and it's like we want our cake and to eat it too.
and eat it too. Yeah, it's like because that was the whole reason why they went to the islands, that they wanted to avoid people who ruins precious things. They wanted to avoid the tourists. They wanted to go to an island that they wouldn't be bothered. And yet they finally go and find this community. And then they like I think people quickly realize that like, hey, if you want a perfect community, if you want a perfect island and actually like maintain the preciousness and specialty of this place, you have to work. Yeah, you have to work and maintain what we have established here. And that's where people were slipping.
Yeah, I think,
Because oh yeah, sorry, just one more. It's like because when Richard draws the map, like draws a copy of the map, that was given to him to this place and allows other tourists come in, again ruining, like bringing other external people in and ruining your fun. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. I mean, like in an odd way, the ideal, remember that opening scene from the Lost World Jurassic Park where they're on, whatever the dinosaur island site B, but they're on their yacht and they have their people? Like, in a weird way, like that's what I imagine these people like ultimately want paradise to be. It's like there's no one here, but I have servants for whatever the hell I need. So I want a mimosa and lounge on the beach. Great. I got my people, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, yeah, and that takes work too. It's like they're everyone has to be on the same page to keep them going. Um, and I think and that kind of goes in with like just the theme of paradise is like something perfect is not always all that perfect. So what were your thoughts of the symbolism of Eden? They called it Eden, which if you're anything religious or Christian. Eden's the Garden of Eden where, you have Adam and Eve, but then it gets ruined by the Satan, and then shit goes down from there. We know the rest, and the rest is literally history. So calling this island Eden, what were your thoughts of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly sort of in your face in that regard, but I mean, it was tainted to begin with because I mean, they're essentially growing weed illegally, right? Not them,
Hmm.
but the other side of the island. And so you could call that the pact with the devil in some sense of like, all right, you keep to your side. You don't say anything about what we're doing, and we don't disturb you. Don't bring no people around here, and we're
Right.
good. Disturb that homeostasis, and things won't be so pleasant. So, yeah, it's in that way very weird because it was poison to begin with.
Right. It was like the symbiotic idea of, turn the other cheek too. Like, we don't bother you, you don't bother us. Um, and there's just like a line that really stuck with me. In the book is like why they why there's so many limited peoples there. There's the line like Jed, the one of the main guys on the island. He wanted to rely on the island's natural barriers. They're the swim that they had to get through first, then get past the dope fields, which and the cannabis workers that are armed with AK-47s, and then find the lagoon. That's a whole nother location, and then getting all the way down to the beach. So there's all these natural barriers and steps that people have to get through just to get there. So if you actually do make the destination, you kind of have earned your right to stay there, and mostly they rely on like people usually give up and turn around, so that like already deters a lot of people. But the fact that like it's such work to get to paradise, that in itself is a red flag. That's a humongous just warning, like, hey, maybe it's because you guys already started off on the wrong foot. Maybe this should have been a warning.
I mean, I know there was a lot of time spent on justifying this island being like off the grid, but I don't know. I mean, it was written in the 90s, so it's not like we didn't like Google Maps wasn't as perfected as it is today, but it's still hard for me to believe of like, wait, no one knew this island. You know what I mean? Like we've kind of
Right.
explored the world.
I'm not even sure Google was around then yet.
I
We're
mean,
still
Google was
like
definitely around then.
Yahoo was definitely around. Google wasn't as what it was as it is today. It wasn't like it back then.
Sure,
But
but
yeah,
it's
it's
not like we
definitely
hadn't explored the world and didn't have, charts and things
right.
like that.
Yeah, it's
So
like they had their ability to reconnect with regular civilization, especially when they did the rice runs and went for back for supplies every once in a while. But it's like I think the movie did a better job of visualization, maybe for me, that I understood like they were so willing to give up everything for the secrecy, that they're like they put like all this pride. They're like, no, we're not going to go to the hospital. We're going to just pull your tooth. No, we're not going to go get checked out by doctors. We're just going to let our bodies get consumed by gangrene. Like legit, they're willing to die to keep the secrecy and sanctity of the place. And that got to a very, very level of extreme, where in the movie, you see Sal, all the mental things that she's willing to do to protect that island and the people. Like she's willing to kill Richard and shoot him in front of everybody, even though we know it's inhumane and immoral. She's still willing to do it. And I think they really touched upon like just the level of what people will go through.
yeah, and that was the thing. Like, so ultimately, the sort of twist, if there is one, is that this whole thing was a secret mission from Daffy to kind of expose this island. Um, so I'm curious your thoughts on that whole reveal, if you will.
Yeah, it's also kind of like when something's so secret, you feel like you have to tell someone, but also I was like, I feel for some reason, this will make sense for both you and I. It's like we both used to run a network, a lot of personal secrets. We've gone through a lot of shit. And it's like, I feel maybe people get to a point where like, so, well, someone has to know what we went through. Someone has to like, at least I have to vent to someone. So it's like, I'm not crazy if I tell someone else about this secret place. And I feel like Daffy got to that point. He had been one of the first inhabitants of the island. It affected him. He was there for so long, it affected him. He went back to the mainland and then he was trying to reach out to people. Maybe that was his desperate attempt to be like, hey, someone else needs to go to this island and understand where I'm coming from. They need to understand what this place does to people. And so maybe someone can understand me. And I feel like that's the reason why Daffy got so many quote unquote people involved, by extension by this map. And then it kind of we see at the end we see Richard get to the point of like, oh yeah, this island does do things to people. It does mess with us mentally. People do need to know about this.
Yeah, I mean it's weird, you know. I mean, it literally led Daffy to his own suicide, right? So, luckily, Richard did not suffer the same fate. Although, as we know, the two people, the Americans that were trying to get to the beach, they they
Not
weren't so lucky. It,
so
it
much.
it was like this. I felt like it was this like ticking time bomb, and uh, eventually it was like, okay, well, what's going to happen once they get there? And they're just shot dead, essentially.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
that's it.
Like they couldn't get past, level one, the first
Yeah.
checkpoint of the dope fields. They get caught by the workers there. And I think it's just like again, just like another point in the story where like, oh, this also happened. People now they're getting to the point of murder that like people literally are getting killed just to get trying to get to this island. That's like a whole nother level, like, oh, this is serious. This is dangerous. Um, and that just like ups it even more. And yeah, it's just I think it's interesting that I mean this book was written it was like published in 96. So this is I feel there in the 90s there was like Thailand, Bangkok, just the country itself was like very in the zeitgeist. You see a lot of stories and movies that surrounded um Thailand in the 90s. So what were your thoughts of that? Just the popularity of a horror story in Thailand.
Yeah, again, like it goes back to that idea. I mean, when you think about it, all the people for the most part, are Westerners, right? You're some Europeans, some, we got the two Americans, but Western nonetheless. And so it is this kind of perverse, both like some ties to colonization in a weird way. And at the same time, also, even if you don't want to stretch it that far, just this idea that like, oh, we're gonna go and experience these cultures, yada yada. And of course it's our right. And so the fact that like they even thought of the beach as sort of their own, because it wasn't meant for tourists to begin with. But of course, when you tell tourists, just even in the greater sense, like, oh, that's off limits, it's like, well, why? Because if it's off limits to tourists, that means it's probably got the best stuff there. So let us go and visit it.
Hmm.
Um, so it's much to that sort of Eden paradise aspect, like it is the forbidden fruit, and we damn sure want it, you know?
It really is, and that's the whole journey. And I think it's unfortunate because I've seen a lot of movies, books, just stories in the media of Thailand, and I hear great things, but then because I like just grew up with this generation of all these horror stories, and granted, most of it's fake, fictional stories about it. Thailand, I was like, I'm not sure if I want to go. That doesn't seem like a safe place. Um, I mean,
Well,
there,
let me tell
it's like,
you, let for okay, so this counters my earlier point of like I think to me there's a way to travel that is much more like when I travel, I want to like actually be more immersed in the culture and stuff like that. Like I don't want to just stay at like a five-star resort and this and that. Like I want to see more of the daily life and I want to be more of an observer. Maybe that's the documentarian side of me versus like
right.
this posh tourist. But anyway, um, I say to people all the time, like, listen, if I was looking at the US news and things like that, I'd be like, those people are crazy. All they do is kill each other.
Yeah.
So, when you just view things from a very small prism, every place seems dangerous. When I promise you, it's not. And in fact, America might be more dangerous than Thailand in that respect. You know what I mean?
Yeah, seriously. It's like when you go to a foreign place that you're not used to, it's like, yeah, those external fears just kind of build up. And it's also like I was just in a foreign country just a week ago, and I'm with you, Phil. Like I went to the capital. I left my five-star resort to see the rest of the country. I wanted to learn about the culture and how that country came to be and in the history. And I feel like a lot of the stories in the 90s, at least what I've been exposed to, what a lot of just people in general have been exposed to, is that like ignorance can really ruin a trip, ruin the story. They make Americans so stupid, just like low intelligence, and quite honestly, a lot of Americans are stupid. But but it's also like common sense is not something that's prevalent and it's like a recurring theme that everyone's just ignorant. Therefore, shit hits the fan and no one knows how to fix it.
Well, that
And therein lies all the conflicts.
and there's a disrespect, right? I mean, similarly, people look at Mount Everest as the pinnacle of, mountain climbing or whatever, right? From an outside looking in. But because, oh, it's the highest peak ever, got to summit it, blah, blah. It's actually not as hard to summit. Like, it's certainly not the hardest in the world from an actual mountaineering perspective. What actually makes climbing Mount Everest high is because it's such a tourist destination. People are stealing oxygen tanks, like all the stuff that we're talking about, like killing and stuff like it's theft of, from tourists and this and that. And you have to quite literally hire, um, you know, quote unquote bodyguards, Sherpas to help navigate you, and they know, and you essentially have to pay like your passage to make sure you're not screwed with. Otherwise,
Hmm.
yeah, they're gonna steal your ox. And like, what do you do when you're up there and you're out of oxygen tank? So, ironically, if we just had a greater level of respect for the places that we visit, and again, being more of that symbiosis rather than of like, you know, I'm going to climb Mount Everest, but we're going to commercialize the hell out of it, and this is the byproduct of all of it. Like it's just such a perverse thing that continues to happen. So I don't inherently think tourism is negative. I just think when you commercialize it, the hell out
Right.
of it, that's the issue.
And also just reinforces the fact like the more accessible you make it to people, the more likely it is to get ruined because people suck. More people, like when more people get their hands on something, you're likely to ruin and taint this perfect image. And that is what we got on this island. More people were coming to the island and shit was hitting the fan. So it's like it was getting outside. The problem was outside of the community, not, and it just like it started on the inside. It's a ripple effect, really. It started on the inside and then it just worked its way out
Yeah,
and it
like
got bigger and bigger.
like we essentially want the illusion of whatever it is. Like imagine like, oh, I want to go live in the Amazon. Like, okay, on paper that sounds nice, but in order to do that, like of course, you know, if we were to actually do that, half the Amazon would be cut down because it's like, I just want the illusion that I'm living in the Amazon, but I want all the
Hmm.
amenities of everyday life,
Yeah.
and this is yeah. So I think and knowing Alex Garland's work, like in many ways, he does have that. I mean, this in and of itself is kind of that aspect of, tourism and yada yada. But when you look at the totality of his work, he has that sort of certainly annihilation, like how do you live in balance with the world,
Right.
and where the world doesn't see justice necessarily, like justice is a made up human word. It doesn't really exist, So
Hmm.
when a shark or a squid, in this sense, like poisons you, it's like, Is that justice? Well, I don't know. It just happened, So
Yeah,
there you go.
like life happens. It's how you know, it's how you deal with the situation. And they did not deal with it properly. They were all turning against each other. And I think that's because they were so removed from regular society, they forgot how to work as a society themselves. Um,
Well, I also
speaking of
think,
Garland, oh, wait,
oh, sorry,
yeah,
I was just gonna say it also, I mean, it just shows the pitfalls of society to begin with, where like, okay, you have these 30 some odd people and they can't get it to work. So,
yeah,
we have these millions upon millions of people, and it might be a damn near miracle the fact that anything functions half as good as it may.
yeah. But they somehow got along for six years, and somehow it just at some point something got to give. Um, and we kind of see that same current recurring theme in Garland's stories, Alex Garland. So a little bit more about him. He attended the Independent University College School in Hampstead, London. He studied art history. He also wrote screenplays for 28 Days Later, and one of my favorite stories, books, movies ever, Never Let Me Go. I constantly am talking about that. He wrote the screenplay for that. So like, and a lot of he had his directorial debut with Ex Machina, also known for Annihilation. Just recently, what's the movie that you just saw this past
Civil
summer?
War.
Civil War. So yeah, so he just a lot of his stories have this recurring theme of how humanity works together. If you if you in like within a society, if they don't work, then if things aren't working together, then everything crumbles. Um,
Yeah, I mean,
and
not
it's
that Men was a good movie, but it was like that's one of a very telling movie of like you're like looking at things and you're going through something. I don't know what you're going through,
mm,
but seeing men, stuff is happening.
yeah,
That movie
yeah.
is wild, to
Yeah,
say
and
the
I feel like
least.
that's like a recurring thing for all of his movies. It's like the importance of being with someone else, like this importance of communities, because we see a lot of these movies or like a lot of just stories when they're isolated, what it does to people. Especially like Ex Machina and Annihilation. Like when you're surrounded and something's happening, like, am I going crazy? But I can't tell because no one else is around. So like you get to that point, you're like, huh, something's happening. And I think it's very interesting for me personally. Like I love human behavior and like how we as a society, we are human social beings. As much as we don't want to be, like humanity is what keeps the world going. And I feel Garland's stories really touch upon like what happens when we cut ourselves off from the regular world. And
Yeah.
that's what makes interesting stories. Anything else about this book that we may or may not have covered?
No, I mean, if you're expecting the movie's very different. Let's just put it that
It
way.
is.
Like some of the characters are even different. So, you know,
Yeah.
if you're looking for an adaptation in that pure sense, don't, don't. Not saying it's good or bad, it's just different. So,
Yeah. The movie takes like a more, I would say, violent turn of people turning against each other and therefore forcing everyone to like go home. Like, okay, if we can't all enjoy this, we might as well all literally go home. And that's kind of what happened. And this is just like individually self-destruction of everybody, which ultimately collapsed the entire community compared to like an external source in the movie, like the cannabis workers literally fired like pointed guns at people, like go home, you're done. Um, so it's like it was a lot of more factors I feel in the movie that forced them to go home.
yeah,
And
it's got
whereas
quite
the
the cast too.
Yeah, it does. I mean, Tilda Swinton, Leonardo DiCaprio back in, I mean, he's still a hot commodity these days as an actor, but I was like, it's a very solid cast if you haven't seen it. I just rewatched it, so it's fresh in my head. And I'm like, I think it still ages fairly well. I mean, yeah, visual graphics, quote unquote, not that great, but like the whole idea of um being isolated so much because they're in the movie, they purposely separate Richard from the community, and he's left alone in the forest by himself, where his character kind of turned, and he's the one who's starting to go crazy, which therefore now is he the villain? And I feel like they did that more in the movie than the book.
Yeah.
So yeah, the movie does take more creative liberties. Um, so it's like it really depends on it's up to you and it's subjective of what you think is better, the book or the movie. But ultimately, I mean, I always enjoyed the movie, and that's another reason why I wanted to read this book. I was like, oh, what's the book like? And here we are. And yeah. So speaking of books, Phil, what have you been reading in
Uh,
the meantime?
Nothing too much in terms of quantity, but I have quality certainly there. I am reading the
Yes.
second book in the Poppy War
So good.
series. We did the Poppy War as literally our first ever book discussion. So R.F. Kwan wrote, two more books in this series, and so I got back into it, and it was pretty easy pickup, It's
Yeah.
exactly where I left my friends. There they are, angry and upset and ready to kill the world as they always were.
Even more. It's
So,
so good. Yeah, continue because I've read them and yeah, I was like, I love that series. So good. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I was just on vacation, so I got the chance to read a bit. I read A Movable Feast and The Sun Also Rises from Ernest Hemingway, classic writer. So that was interesting. I also read Gold by E.J. Noyes. And then it just came back. And of course, the first thing I did, my first day back, I went to the library, as one does. And so future readings I'll have I'm a Woman, What Can I Say? Ugly Love by Colin Hoover. She's in the very much in the romantic zeitgeist right now. And then something that's also in the zeitgeist thanks to Netflix. I have a Three Body Problem. The show apparently is getting rave reviews. And so I was like, well, being the nerd, I like to read things first. And yeah, so those are the current things that I shall be reading down the pipeline. Upcoming books that we'll be talking about, we have your choice for next month, Elder Race.
yeah, it's a fantasy novel. It's very quick. It's by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and it's basically about this princess. Like there's a demon, there's a plague, they don't know what it is that's like killing off people. And so um, this princess who doesn't get a lot of credit, she's like the fourth heir essentially, so no one like thinks highly of her at all. She there's a family promise where like, hey, if you ever need anything, go summon the wizard. So she says, I'm gonna go summon the wizard and we're gonna solve this. Um, and so yeah, that's the premise. It's a lot. It's more intriguing than that. Like it's not all things are as they seem essentially, and that's what makes it fun.
Mhm.
So
Fun. And then my choice, I did decide something for us in September. This full disclosure, the Summer Olympics literally just started. Not to put a timestamp on this show, but to totally time code our show. Just started like today. So Olympics are very on the top of my mind. So our next story, Vengeance, the true story of an Israeli counter-terrorist. That book is about the whole Munich Olympics back in the 70s, a very infamous Olympics where seven Israeli Olympians were killed and started a whole whole thing. And I think it's also be very telling of what happened back then and how it's still relevant today and where our society is now with Israeli and Iran and those countries going. And it's the Olympics are going on right now. So it's still very timely, relative thing for us. So I think that'll be an interesting read. Maybe it'll help us understand things a little bit better.
it
And then
sure
your
can.
choice.
So then we're going to do a bit of a cleanse after that called Near to the Wild Heart by Clarice Lispector. So this is a South American author, but it's very much kind of in that vein of, classical writers. Why am I blanking on the names? The women authors who did like Pride and Prejudice and,
Austin.
yeah. So like those types of it evokes that emotion, but with a South American flair, written by obviously a woman as well. And this
Nice.
was written around in the 1920s, give or take. So
Nice. I'm excited for that. Yeah, I'll probably pick a happier choice in November for to finish out the year, round out for us. Yeah, but a lot of good things coming up. Phil, in the meantime, where can everyone keep following your stuff?
at Phil Svitek, keeping it simple.
There you go. And you can follow me everywhere at Serafini TV. You can follow all of us, everywhere on Phil's YouTube channel, his podcast. He has amazing videos every day. That keeps up with everything in the world, because you're better at it than I am. Thanks everyone for tuning in, reading with us. We have more books in the future. Keep reading.